Yeah, so I wanted to talk about extended casts, or you can even go as far as to say background characters. I like to call this crowd control, basically. And we'll talk about how to handle it, not by talking about this one-way method of doing so, but by seeing different examples that we can explore in works of fiction that have already existed. As in reality, there is no one right way of handling a larger cast or just cast members in general or background characters. It's all dependent on your storytelling method and what you're trying to achieve with those characters. So we'll start off with, of course, Naruto and Kishimoto's utilitarian use of his characters. And so what this means is that Kishimoto essentially imagines his characters as toys, so to speak. And so when he needs them, they are there to play with. And so what this means is that he will introduce a lot of characters. So this can be any amount. And then for the purpose of that story, whether it's the arc or the mini arc, so to speak, that he's trying to tell. So whether the character's meant to give motivation, just like Shikamaru or Iruka, or they are meant for a mission and that they are important in that mission. So the uses of the character can be very diverse, whether it's for pure world building or to show how strong another character is. Tenten and Tamari, they match together is a very great example of that. He can use a whole squad as a parallel to another squad. As my colleague has mentioned, he has this theory that Neji, Lee, and Tenten are basically a mirror of Sakura, Naruto, and Sasuke. And this goes as far as to even have both Guy and Kakashi being rivals. And when I say parallels, I mean that they are similar, but have certain differences that are glaring. I think the parallels between those two teams are quite compelling, but I think that it is too long and it deserves its own video. But I'll just give you a rundown of what he's saying. So basically what he's saying is that, thematically speaking, Team Guy is what the audience thinks Team 7 is, where you have Sakura being a character who is eventually supposed to, not necessarily eventually, but is supposed to be admiring Tsunade, who's a powerful Konoichi, and that she has this aspiration of being as strong as Tsunade. You have Lee, who has a very usual, at the time, shonen protagonist goal of being the best or being a splendid ninja and to be recognized for that reason alone. And then you have Neji with Sasuke, thematically with the fates that they have drawn into their lives, with the difference being that while Neji needs to accept his fate, Sasuke is supposed to reject it. So I'll go into his explanation of this because I don't know the full thing, but to me it sounded very convincing. That being said, those are the uses that you can have for the different characters. So Kishimoto essentially takes a toy when necessary for these certain reasons, whether it's the mission, as I said. And this is very prevalent throughout the story. So we see Iruka when Iruka is needed. We see the third Hokage when the third Hokage is needed. You don't see the characters intermingling off screen. You don't see any of that. The Naruto series is very utilitarian in that way. You're only seeing the characters when they are important. The benefits of this is that Kishimoto doesn't have to think about how every single character is reacting to something that's happening currently to one of the other characters. So Naruto's going through a depression arc or something like that, or Naruto has to fight this big bad guy. We don't need to see every member of Kona 11 reacting to how Naruto has to fight this bad guy and how they have to do something or get stronger or something of that nature. The only characters you'll see are the characters that Naruto is either training with or the people who are going to be giving him advice on his training, like Asuma, the training of wind chakra, or somebody expanding lore during the training. That of course is still relevant to the training itself. And an example of this would be Shizune when she was trying to get Naruto to give up on his Rasengan training. But then after that you don't see her pop up in the show unless she's relevant, like with the mystery of pain or being naturally around Tsunade. So the inevitable drawbacks of this way of crowd control is mostly based off of the audience, because a lot of people have favorite characters, or they like the design of certain characters, therefore they want to see the character more. For example, people want to see more of Choji, this rotund boy that has a goofy design. Maybe they like to see him, they like his attitude and how he feels about being fat and how he rages about it. But with the utilitarian approach of writing, you won't see him much. You will barely see him because he's not relevant into the story yet. His thematic struggles for his character are not useful for now. And so what you have is that Asuma needs to die much later on, and then you'll have some scenes of Choji, but you won't see a lot of it because utilitarian reasons, Shikamaru is the focus here. And so Choji will be separated. Ino and Choji are separated from Asuma in the squads that are supposed to be hunting the Katsuki members. And what we see is that Asuma's death is not important to Choji's character for now. It will only be important to Choji's character later on in the war when he has to fight his reanimated sensei. But in all that, you barely see Choji. And so these are the drawbacks. A lot of people can be watching the series for certain characters, but then those characters barely show up in the story, if not at all in the end. Maybe they only had a one-time use and that was all you needed them for. And from the current trends I've been seeing in the audience world of writing and media is that people want to see more fleshed out characters now. They say fleshed out characters, but what they mean is that they want to see more of the characters, and those characters having a lot of agency outside of the pure story reasons that they exist. And that leads me to Oda. So Oda has a sort of mixture of utilitarian but leans more, which is why you should probably view it as a spectrum instead of just simply something that has a defined name. But he leans more into having every character have something to do and say at the same time that everything is happening. So what Oda does is to basically introduce a bunch of new characters, but he introduces them on an island that the main cast can leave. So first we are introduced to the main cast, island by island, collecting the main cast. And then what we have is once he writes certain characters to being in the main cast, which would be the Straw Hats crew, so to speak, because the world is one that is seafaring, he uses that to his advantage and makes it so that he can introduce a lot of characters at the same time because he's able to leave the islands that they come from. And so most of the crowd control that he has to manage are with the Straw Hats themselves, the very cast members that you're going to be spending a lot of your time with. And then he jumps to other islands, introduces more characters, and does, the usual background, everything, context information of those characters, their importance in the world. But then he also has the characters that he's already introduced from previous arcs and previous islands. He has them do stuff in the background, whether it is reactions to the news of what the Straw Hats are doing or their own little adventures. And so by doing that, he can have those characters affect the wider world and have essentially unexpected things happen in his plot lines. But it's not unexpected because you have this knowledge that the world of One Piece is moving even when the characters are not around, the main characters are not around. Because he shows us this, you have this feel that something is happening, and it's not surprising at all to see a character we didn't expect jumping into the scene, doing incredible things or affecting the world in incredible ways or even minuscule ways. This also helps him with future events where characters can cause future plot lines, just like how with Ace going off and fighting Blackbeard caused the Marineford War and allowed for a lot of world building through seeing Impel Down, the Justice Gates, I forgot what it was called, or rather seeing the gates again, being in actual use, returning other characters that have been long since gone, those who are previous enemies. And so he does a lot with his characters in that way. But of course, Oda does this because of the type of story that he's writing, as his story takes the route of an epic, like the Odyssey by Homer, while Kishimoto takes the route of a chronicle of some type of legendary figure from the past and how they changed the world. And someone's story like Alexander the Great would be told in such a way, where there are things that are important about Alexander's life and the greater world around him, but not as important as to overshadow Alexander the Great himself, strictly telling us about the effects that affected Alexander himself in his journey to gaining the title of being Alexander the Great. You can also use the A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones style of crowd control that is characterized by its lack of a main character and is actually treating, well, because of POVs, you're treating everybody as a main character. And so whoever is important, their perspective is important at the time, the story will shift to them. And so through that, you can tell wildly different stories with the same themes. I've heard this being called that the world itself is the actual main character, and the characters are simply there to explore the said world. I do like this way of putting things as it makes things sound. It's easier to just use, let's be honest. If you did want to keep characters around, maybe by necessity, an example of this would be My Hero Academia, where because it's a school setting, Horikoshi, well, it's not that he has to follow this, but what he does in the end is that because it's a school setting, the side characters are almost always around the protagonist, and they have little reason to not be. And so what he does is that there is a proper name for this, but I'm going to use a more dumbed down version of the name. But essentially, he makes the characters shadows of themselves, and he essentially employs Kishimoto's, not that Kishimoto created this, as I said before, he's using more of a biography chronicling type of storytelling. But Horikoshi essentially switches off, or rather puts them on screensaver mode. So an example of this would be the arc where Ida lost his brother? No, his brother was heavily injured by Stain, the hero killer. And so before that, Ida came off as some goofy guy and stiffler for the rules. But then when it was time for his arc, we focused in on him and he felt like he had more personality, as if he was an actual person. And so after the arc, we see that slowly but surely, because you can't just be abrupt with this, slowly but surely he loses that heavy characterization, as if we're focusing on him, as if the camera is slowly moving away from him. And then we can now switch over to something else. And so he goes back to his former state of being a shadow of who he is. So he will always see him in the background doing classroom stuff or whatever, or participating in whatever he has to participate in because of how the story works. So he is still there. So unlike Kishimoto, Horikoshi doesn't switch off the character, but he puts them on screensaver mode. And so they're still there. They act like they would, but they don't feel like human beings, so to speak. So it's basically a reflection of real life. And what I mean by that is how you perceive real life, where you can know that your friend is talking to somebody else, but you don't actually have intimate knowledge of what they're talking about because you're doing your own thing. You're talking to your own friend, or you're doing your own classroom assignment, but you can see them in the background. They're doing their own thing. They're living their own life, and we can visually see them, but you don't know what's happening. And so you can only know what's happening when you actually walk over to them and have a full-on conversation. And in a sense, they become human to you again. I hope you understand that. It does sound very strange and inhumane when I'm making an example of real people. So I hope you understand the essence of what I'm saying. Oh yes, I forgot. So the drawbacks of Oda's way of handling, or rather of crowd control, is that we can have instances where people do not want to see certain characters or what they're doing, or if we're going to be manga specific, where, especially if you're in a week by week basis, what can happen is that he can be showing the reactions or storylines of certain characters and what they're doing in a way that you do not want to see it at that moment. Maybe you do not care about that character, and so now this character is in your face. This connects also with George Martin in A Song of Ice and Fire, where you can be reading a POV of a character you do not care for, or you do not care for what that POV is showing because you're not interested in that part of the world. But in Oda's case, he uses every single part of his manga to tell his story in a way that's not exhaustive. And that means that, I don't know what it's called, but it's at the beginning of the chapter. He can put like small stories of what the characters in the background are doing. And so that's also a smart way that he does things, so that it's not too exhaustive, and yet he doesn't have to go into too much detail of what this background character is doing. That is going to be important in the future, but you just don't want to see it. And it doesn't interrupt with the main story, at least to the audience's opinion. Not that it objectively is interrupting with the story. When it comes to the drawbacks of Horikoshi's method, then again, this is not that he created this method, it's just one of the methods that exist. But the drawback of the screensaver mode is that people will have characters that they like, but then while they are in the background, it feels that they are never focused on. It would be a mirror of essentially Kishimoto's drawbacks with his utilitarian use of the characters, where now it can be viewed as more painful because now you're being teased, so to speak, with this character being in the background, but they just won't step out of the background. It's all retch and no vomit. It never gets there. And so that feeling can be frustrating to an audience member that wants to see that character more. There are many other examples that I can make from Bleach, Jujutsu Kaisen, Musashi. No, I'm not talking about not Vinland Saga. I'm talking about Vagabond, rather. But this is just a few that I wanted to make examples of to show the diversity of ways that you can crowd control. And the main point of this video is to basically inspire you to, as a writer, if you're a writer, inspire you to research your favorite authors to a certain degree and see how they do their crowd control. And you can emulate it. But the most important thing is that when you are emulating it, make sure that you're focusing on what type of story you're trying to make. I don't want to see a One Piece type of story, but then you write it in a way that's more like Naruto. It wouldn't make sense. And so remember, there's no right way of doing things, so to speak. There is only what works for your story. And so it's important that you actually pay attention to these details. Yeah, that'll be the end of the video. I'll see you next time.